and welcome everyone. We are ready to begin our next session for the Move Utah Summit. Let me share my screen just so that you can see what we're talking about here. All right, this session is keeping it real, advancing equity in active transportation. And so we've got a great panel prepared for you today to cover some of the discussions that are going on and developing around transportation equity here in Utah. First of all, I do want to acknowledge our summit partners. Thank you to all of your organizations that help make this program possible. And then I do want to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I have a few things to introduce our topic today. But we have Claudia Loaiza from the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs with us. And she has been such a great resource for us in transportation because she holds transportation near and dear to her heart as she's working on her master's in urban planning. And so she has that multicultural expertise while also a real interest in how our communities are designed and how transportation plays a role in that. And so thank you, Claudia, for being with us today. Nikki Navio from the Wasatch Front Regional Council. I'm so glad that Nikki is here. She's doing some really interesting work around equity and transportation, speaking into the Wasatch Choice 2050 principles and that coalition of partnering agencies, as well as in our long-range planning and regional transportation planning processes. So thank you, Nikki, for being here as well. And our third panelist is Angelo Papastamos from the Utah Department of Transportation. And Angelo has been a champion for transportation equity for many, many years in many, many forms. And so I'm excited to hear what he has to share with us today about how that conversation is developing over time. So before we move to our panelists, I do just want to share and set the stage a little bit for a discussion about transportation equity. And I should introduce myself. I'm Eileen Barron. I'm a strategic communications manager with planning and investment at the Utah Department of Transportation. And one of my assignments has been working on an equity, diversity, inclusion, and access strategy for us here at UDOT. And that's part of the reason I'm here facilitating, because this is a topic I've been engaging with, both in terms of how we deliver our services at UDOT, as well as for us as a workplace. And through that experience, I want to highlight three key resources for you that sort of set the stage for what is both a local, statewide, and national conversation about transportation equity. On the local front, I want to point you to the Utah Compact on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which was put out initially by the Salt Lake Chamber, but many, many entities have signed on to this compact, including our governor, Spencer Cox, our previous governor, Gary Herbert, as well as for us at UDOT, Carlos Caceres. And many of our other partnering agencies have also signed this Utah Compact. You should be able to find it on the Salt Lake Chamber site, or if you Google Utah Compact on Racial Equity, I think it'll hit high in your search. I want to highlight this because that compact outlines 5 key principles. And I think because it's been endorsed by our political leaders, by our agency leaders, our industry leaders, it is a really great place to start when we're having equity discussions. And so I encourage you to take a look at those principles, and really that's for us here statewide in Utah. Another piece of the statewide conversation is a new paper that was published by the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs. And Claudia is a co-author of that paper. And its title is The State of Transportation Equity in Utah, an Evolving Movement. And if you go to the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs site, I think you can find this paper under their resources, and they have several publications, but this one was just published, I think, in January or February. It's this year that it was released. So it's very recent and current, and it's a nice summary of what's happening among some of our transportation agencies, and kind of setting forth a vision and some principles to think about in terms of transportation equity in Utah going forward. And so I'm hoping Claudia will have a chance to touch on some of those principles today. The third thing I wanted to make you aware of really is about the national conversation related to equity. And this is a federal highways document that was just published this spring, or this winter, I should say. And it's a congressional report that was issued in response to how FHWA is going to address the increase in pedestrian fatalities. It's called Moving to a Complete Streets Design Model, a report to Congress on opportunities and challenges. And so I think maybe if you Google FHWA complete streets, they maybe are using complete streets in a little bit of a different way than what some of you might be familiar with the term complete streets. So I encourage you to take a look at this report, but certainly it signals a federal attention and endorsement to thinking about equity in our modes of transportation and how we allocate funds and resources and investments going forward. So today's conversation is another step into this transportation equity conversation. And I did want to refer to those three things for those of you who want to learn more or have some additional tools and resources to dig in, because we have maybe just half an hour, 40 minutes to give you a taste, a slice of what conversations are happening here in Utah among some major transportation providers, being UDOT, WFRC, and then how our friends at the Division of Multicultural Affairs is helping us speak into this transportation equity conversation. So with that, Claudia, I'd really like to turn the time over to you to kind of introduce what do we mean by equity and what are some of the key terms and considerations we should make when we enter into conversations about equity.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Eileen. And I really appreciate all the resources that you shared and for convening us into this space. This is a very important topic to me, as Eileen mentioned. I work for the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs as their communications and community engagement coordinator, but I am currently finishing up my master's in city and metropolitan planning at the University of Utah as well. So hoping to graduate this coming May. So this idea of transportation equity obviously has a lot of intersections with how we design and create connected communities. And equity is a really key pillar to that in terms of making sure that we're creating spaces where every community can thrive and taking into account the different historical and systemic contexts of how certain communities have been affected or barred from achieving certain opportunities. So with that, I do want to just mention before we start, here are some group norms and just invitations for you all to lean into. Obviously, when we talk about equity and addressing systemic gaps, they can be difficult topics and they have so many different repercussions. And I personally believe that they do require a certain state of mind so that way we can not just learn new things and learn from each other, but also try to identify the areas maybe where we need to have more personal growth ourselves. So number one, I invite you all to stay engaged in whatever way that feels like, that looks like for you in a virtual space, and then lean into that discomfort and be aware of what things are starting to make you feel uncomfortable in talking about equity, in operationalizing it and thinking about it so that you can invite opportunities to grow. And then also, making space for different lived experiences outside of your own. So we'll be talking about intersectional identities and experiences with transportation, I think, throughout this. So I hope that also welcomes some curiosity and enhancing of your learning and asking questions and striving to also, if you have to disagree with the idea and not necessarily the person. I think this is just a common thread that can hopefully help us have better conversations and engagements with each other. And then finally, expect and accept non-closure. We may not be able to answer all of your questions or solve all the different issues surrounding transportation equity and connected communities today. But this is a start. This is where you can feel more equipped with next steps and different resources and mentalities and mindsets that you can start looking into so that you have that desire for continued learning and growth. So Moving on, an equity mindset, as I mentioned a little briefly, is thinking about all the different perspectives and experiences that folks bring into a space, and understanding and calling to attention certain patterns of inequity that emerge, and then actively challenging them as well. So for some folks, that might mean being willing to take that personal and institutional responsibility for the welfare of all that we serve. And then being able to critically assess our own practices when it doesn't acknowledge the needs of everyone. So this is very much needed because our community is, as you know, growing, and it's also diversifying. Utah is, one of the leading states in our nation for those changing demographics, and people of color are driving much of that growth here. So as a state, we need to address this increasingly diverse and growing population by building up systems, institutions, and services, and that soft infrastructure as well within our organizations that are culturally affirming and creating belonging within our transportation networks. Because as we know with the pandemic, as we've learned through the hardest times of this experience, a one-size-fits-all approach is problematic, and it does not work. That's kind of that's what I've learned. What our division has come to the conclusion of, that seeing our communities experience high case rates, mortality rates, and systemic impacts, we need to really be intentional in our approaches to bridge gaps. And equity mindsets, I think, will help us transform the way that our organizations approach gaps, and then also building trust with communities so that way we can more proactively meet needs as they come. So I'm going to quickly go over just some quick shared language around equity, and then also some principles around diversity, inclusion, and belonging and access. And I do want to just preface that, as you see in the middle, the term justice, when we use the term justice in this space, and as we continue learning with each other, I do want to mention that for this context, what I'm referring to is creating a just and fair society where folks can access the necessary resources and systems to create a thriving environment for themselves. So all of these 4 components, as you see here, lead into that environment. And starting with diversity, we've heard that term a lot. I think understand the preface of what it means. It's the diversity of the people in the room, right? Who is in the room, the range of human interests, backgrounds, and experiences that folks can represent and express. And then with that, it's a little bit beyond of what we want to go with. Inclusion is and belonging is all about enabling folks to feel safe, respected, and engaged, and motivated as an active participant in the environment that you invite them into. And their diversity, their experiences and lived experiences should be affirmed in that space, so that way that sense of belonging, that feeling, is retained. And then access is really about widely creating an environment, product, or device, or a service, or a system that can be used by as many people as possible. And that's regardless of age, ability, or background. That might be something a little bit more connected to transportation. Maybe that might click a little bit more. And as we know, equity is one of those key cornerstones. It's the creation of opportunities for historically underserved and marginalized populations who have been barred from achieving due to systemic inequities. And I do want to note that it is different from equality. We often confuse the two sometimes, and equality, is giving everyone essentially the same thing, regardless of who and what experiences they have overcome or have brought into the space, while equity focuses on giving people what they need and have historically lacked, and is affirming and aware of those different lived experiences. So this, again, is in goal of justice, to create a full and impactful environment where all groups in society feel that they've mutually shaped a thriving environment to meet their needs. So this last slide I'm going to show you is just a way for you to maybe personify some of these things. If equity, diversity, inclusion, and access were to walk into a room, diversity would maybe ask who from this room is missing or who is in the room, while equity would respond with who's trying to get into the room but can't. So whose presence is constantly under threat of erasure or being challenged. And then with inclusion, it would further continue to preface, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Once they are here, can they stay? Do they feel that they are invited and affirmed enough to be able to remain in the environment? And then, lastly, when we talk about access, it would ask, is the environment set for everyone to fully participate? So once they are in the space, do they have all the different tools, resources, and connections to be able to stay for the long term and impactfully and mutually, provide shared language, provide shared growth and value around what you're trying to achieve. So I'll leave this at that. And I know that we're going to continue talking about these topics. So Eileen, I'll pass it back on to you.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia, for that introduction. And so another resource we want to highlight is the work that Nikki has been doing at WFRC. And I'm excited for her to share with you some of the tools and resources and information that her team at WFRC has compiled and is making available on a web-based tool. So Nikki, please jump in and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. And I love Claudia's slides because I think that's a really good basis for continuing this conversation. I do have some slides I'd like to share. So let me just walk through some of those. Can you all see my screen? Yes, okay, awesome. So yeah, as Eileen mentioned, I'm a transportation planner with the Wasatch Front Regional Council, and I was going to highlight some pieces that WFRC has been working on regarding equity, including this new equity exploration tool, which we hope would help foster understanding on, on the topics surrounding equity and transportation, and then other pieces that, I hope can advance this conversation equity into more of action. So in the last year, WFRC adopted this organizational goal, which is exciting and kind of a big step for us, which is promoting inclusive engagement in transportation planning processes and equitable access to affordable and reliable transportation options. We've really spent most of the time looking at these areas of emphasis in WFRC's work to help support this new goal. One of these is access to opportunities, which I think most folks are particularly familiar with. This is where we are looking at best possible transportation and land use decisions that can support community choice and economic vitality. We use this tool and access to opportunities as part of our decision-making for long-range planning and our transportation improvement program, particularly with looking at an equity focus area lens. We also are trying to be better with engaging with our broad communities and aim to improve our existing practices to make them more inclusive. This is also looking at our different methods of outreach and platforms. And then we're also looking at our administration as a whole. So what we've done in the last year and a half or so is develop this internal organizational equity working group, which has a representative from all our different programs to try to evaluate what our, look at our current practice, see if there's, any understanding that we could get from resources that might be both beneficial internally as well as externally, and trying to reevaluate some of those, some of those current practices. Are we on par with what other MPOs are doing, or is there more that we can be doing? And last is that decision making. So, we're looking at how we prioritize equity in our decision making within those programs. It's all of these four areas are definitely related to each other. And I think the biggest factor that we've really tried to emphasize in the last couple of years is try to continue that conversation of, if we don't have certainties defined, but to continue to grow and have a space organizationally to improve the conversation on creating more inclusivity and increase equity. So one of the new tools that I was going to cover is actually this equity, exploring equity tool in the Wasatch Front. So this is basically a one-stop shop for understanding the historical context. You can also find items such as like interactive data relevant to the Wasatch Front, literature resources like the paper that Eileen mentioned that Claudia co-authored, with the Division Multicultural Affairs. So we have some of those resources in this interactive tool. And I just wanted to, the hope with this tool is that, we can have this resource, something for someone out there that is interested, whether it's a planner, elected official, really anyone that it has an interest in a starting point to learn about equity in the transportation space, so we can actually move towards more action. So you can see here, we have a little bit background information of why we're pursuing equity, what is the history, some of the data and trends. And I wanted to show you a little bit more about the historical context. I think most people here are fairly familiar of redlining, but I don't know if we've actually developed this tool where we look specifically at Salt Lake or the Wasatch Front. So this new tool that we have looks at redlining within the two communities that were developed here in the Wasatch Front, so Ogden and Salt Lake. And as many of you know, these maps were really, created to identify the creditworthiness of risk in urban areas and are rated, from an A, B to C and D grade. And what we did is overline this with modern day infrastructure and demographic and different housing conditions. So it's kind of interesting to see, when you look at, let's say, non-percent, white, percent white, and you can see that, a lot of these grades have a direct correlation with what we see present day. When it comes to average home value per person, for example, you can see that the grades that have a higher AB value here, if I turn this off, correlate to a higher home value per person. And so you can use this resource to kind of explore, those two areas that I mentioned here in the Wasatch Front. Let me scroll down to this one, because this shows you a little bit more of the Ogden area. Another item that I wanted to share is that we also looked at the different dimensions of equity challenges and characteristics. So if you click to the data and trends page, we have, information that actually breaks it down to different indicators. So let's look at, like, if you can look at zero car households. Sorry, I know it's taking a little while to load on my end, so you might not be seeing this right away. You can see the breakdown on this within the region. And actually, if you were interested in seeing this statewide, we have this resource. But I will say that Angelo and others actually on this call are working on a Healthy Places Index, which will actually be more of a robust tool that will be looking at these indicators. And I think he'll go into that into more detail. So now that we've walked through some of those things, I just wanted to pivot to other items that we're working on with our transportation partners that can perhaps lead to improving equity. And one of them is the Wasatch Choice Community Advisory. As I mentioned earlier, one of our organizational goals is to try to improve inclusive engagement in transportation planning processes, and it's part of our emphasis area of increasing community engagement. And part of this work with this Wasatch Choice Community Advisory Committee is really, to build capacity relationships, working directly with individuals that represent or work with those populations that are listed here below, so that we can have more understanding of their needs and have more regular dialogue surrounding transportation. And I will acknowledge, when you think about planning and looking at 20 to 30 years down the future horizon, that's, when you ask a person down the street, it's a difficult conversation to have. It's not necessarily concepts that are easy to think about, especially when you're thinking about the immediate, like, I'm paying for my bills, I am working and trying to get my kids food and all of these things. So the purpose of this Wasatch Community Advisory Committee is really to work with different community groups that have a relationship or are direct representatives of these different demographics, so that we can help support them to gain better understanding of how we do transportation planning, and so that we can actually work towards having more meaningful conversations and engagement with everybody. So that's one thing that we're working on with UDOT, with UTA and MAG, and we're hoping to advance more. Another item that I wanted to highlight is that we're working on this new piece where we're collecting transportation stories all across the Wasatch Front. The really purpose of this is to focus on these projects as part of our regional transportation plan. We spend a lot of time prioritizing and looking at projects into the horizon, but I think the purpose of this is really to build that human connection as part of the development of the regional transportation plan. A lot of MPOs across the country do this, and this is something that I acknowledge we realize we need to do more in our work, and so that's something that we're hoping to improve and just share the very real ways that real people in our region actually travel. Because there's a diversity of ways that people do so. And then last of all, I wanted to mention the work that other folks are doing to reduce inequities in active transportation and transportation as a whole, because it's not just happening at the government level. And I wanted to highlight two organizations I'm familiar with and involved with here in Utah. There's obviously others, many others that are doing great work advancing equity, but I wanted to highlight Bike Utah and RAR Salt Lake City. So Bike Utah actually just launched a Level Pedals program, which is looking at incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion in their bike advocacy space. So they're looking at a lot of their existing programs and trying to incorporate things like adaptive cycling and mountain biking series, reaching out to a diverse group of communities all across the state that we haven't really made contact with, in hopes of creating more future projects that are representative of families, adaptive cyclists, rural communities, and really have that at the forefront when they're working on various programs. And the other one with RAR Salt Lake, this is really focusing on creating a space for folks that are genderqueer, non-binary, women, trans folks in cycling. And some of these programs include like, scholarships to increase access and reduce barriers to cycling, such as getting gear and getting bikes. So these are all, really important aspects to building that capacity in terms of trying to advocate for better, ultimately with a goal of better active transportation and transportation as a whole in our region. So I wanted to highlight these two organizations because I think that they're doing great work, but of course there's definitely many others that are community-based organizations out there that can help inform our planning and trying to communicate the needs of those that have diverse needs and experiences. So that's all I have for today. I just really want to thank everybody because I think we've made a lot of progress in this space, and and it's great to be working on improving equity alongside partners. So I'll hand it back over to you, Eileen. Just thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki, and for leading these planning efforts and making this information accessible through WFRC's website, compiling the historical information and some demographic information that can really help build understanding and foster ongoing conversation. So now we want to turn to Angelo, who also I think has a couple of kind of current events, sort of current activities that are happening here in Utah around equity and transportation. And Angelo, I'll hand it over to you to share what you've prepared.
All right, thanks, Eileen. Before I get into my presentation, I just want to start by when I listen to Claudia and Eileen and Nikki, it's just inspiring, honestly. It's like, I love the support that's being, shown in Utah and to move these important issues forward. I consider myself a plant engineer. I kind of implement, so I listen to Claudia's words and Nikki's data and Eileen's wisdom, and I turn it into how do I make transportation decisions out of that? How can I help communities thrive with these transportation? So that's kind of my take on things. And so, getting into my presentation, I want to start with some questions real quick. Feel free, Eileen, to expand on those later if you want to. But I want people to start thinking: do I have an equity engagement plan? Have I identified the underserved and underrepresented communities? Are we working together with community-based organizations? Do we have a process set up to seek and understand and respond? Are we integrating health and transportation? I will dive into the health thing a little bit more as you guys have talked about. And then probably the most important thing, from a DOT and really from a transportation and government and legislation is, are we prepared to invest more time and resources to really make this happen? Okay, it's so important, but we have to invest time and resources for that to happen. By the way, Claudia and Nikki, I steal some slides from you guys, and you'll see on the fly with Zoom, I can snip away as you guys are talking and add it into my slides. So you might see some. But anyway, I think this is from Claudia, it's her white paper. And, what are the drivers of equity in transportation? Data, opportunity, connectivity, safety and comfort, engagement, healthy choices. And all of those are so important as we move this conversation forward. Okay, I think that it's really interesting, and I think Nikki touched on it a little bit, and I'll touch on it later. As you get out there, no one really wants to talk 30 years from planning. What's Wasatch Choice 2050? Okay, it's tough. They want to know what's happening today, and we got a real good taste of that as we launched this Salt Lake study a while ago that I'll get into. But during COVID, you got to keep on topic on what they're interested in. So it's very important that we're so actively listening to the communities on what's important to them and bring in that transportation while keep in mind that we are shooting for long-term plans as well. I think this one's from Nikki's Wasatch Front, and this is a great framework to get started on, and if we all think in these terms, let's identify what the areas are, what are the lower income areas, 25%, 40% people of color, 10% zero car households, where are they? Let's figure that out. Well, in our case, Salt Lake City, as we worked with that partner, and Nikki's map showed it wonderfully, where she showed some redlining and different things. Well, it's clear that we got a West Side situation, that has been disadvantaged for a long time, and there's so many inequities with this. We started with this graphic. I think it was from, I don't have any graphics myself. I think this is from Joe Taylor. And so anyway, we just identified the difference between this area and the rest of Salt Lake City. And you can see on this graphic, well, boy, there's a lot of minorities, in this area. There's a lot of people living below the poverty line that don't speak English well, they have limited access vehicle, they're disabled, that are under the age of 18. So all of these things matter as we look at transportation equity and try to look at the inequities of it. Our framework, after, again, this happened during COVID, and we realized that what we are trying to do was really a travel demand management plan for this West Side area. But what we realized that we need to back off, slow down, and really think about things through equitable engagement. And so we spent the majority of our study on equitable engagement, thinking about access, thinking about options, and then ultimately thinking about what can we do to make this community more equitable, as you just saw on that graphic that I showed. From first thing we did was step aside and listen. We gathered a bunch of service providers in the area and got their feedback. Okay. And I've been in transportation a long, long time, and engineering considers itself the experts for many, many years. We need to get over that and, listen to all other people's perspective on this. So if we see community as experts in equity in their community, it really goes a long way for building the right, building is not the right word, for providing the right transportation accesses that we need to. Okay. So, what we heard there was, and I bolded this one: jobs, access to work, and to finding work. All this was, whenever 2020 COVID, yeah. And people just wanted, how do I get to work? What are you doing to me? And honestly, how do I find work? And obviously, as a DOT, we're not able to necessarily help people find work, but we certainly can work with partners on providing access to opportunities there. And the other thing is that was big was build on health. Give us some active transportation options, reinforce the connections among services and amenities. So all those things mattered so much. And what we started with is not where we went with it all on this. We found out that this is what's important for transportation for the community. I have this slide. It's funny. I have this slide, but I stole one from Claudia, which I want to show better. Okay. So, but basically on this slide, it's move at the speed of trust. Okay. It's like, as you get into conversations, don't think about your current projects. Think about the community and the different things they need, in that community for transportation improvement, so they have great access. Okay. And so this is the slide I snipped, Claudia. Equity mindsets will transform the way organizations approach gaps and opportunities in access. We must build trust with communities to more proactively meet their needs. Love it. Thank you. And so that's the mindset we need to have, as a transportation organization. We need to get there. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the healthy place indices that was mentioned earlier. And so this has been a great effort. Boy, I've been working on transportation and health for about 5 years, and finally we're making some really cool headway. So it's exciting, and it's being led by the Department of Health. And they have great indices. And what we did is we stole something from California. Now we're making it Utahizing it, basically. Okay. The criteria that they had for these community well-placed indices was economic environment, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, structural or system-based determinants, health risk behaviors, and demographics. There's a whole lot to these indices, but my focus has been on the transportation side of it. And so on the transportation side, we have all kinds of limitations to make this happen from the California model, but we were able to agree that these 5 things really matter. These 5 indices really matter, and we need those in there. Okay. Now, California has different versions of them, and so we're trying to meld that all together, but these 5 are so important. And so that first column is the indicators of walkability related, road and pedestrian safety related, which really ties into, Eileen, to that federal highway thing that you had talked about earlier. Frequent transit related, it's such an important thing for people that don't have access to either no cars or one car, and are below the income level. We need frequent transit. Multimodal access to green space, so important for health. And then affordable transportation and housing. Are we building housing by transportation, or we're building transportation by housing, that kind of thing. And so we are working on this. It's so exciting. And the second column is our data sources, and the third column is the data that we gave to California. We did this about, like a month ago, I'd say. And by July, August of this year, we're going to have pretty maps like Nikki shares, that are going to show the community indices across the state based on these, the community health indices across the state based on these indices. Okay, so it's really exciting. And I think I was getting asked yesterday, in fact, about what are we going to be able to do once we see these indices? What are we able to do with that? And we're developing some policy suggestions right now. And we hope that if an area is limited in walkability, then we all know that now. And as transportation decision makers, we can, put our attention to it. Again, it's investing the time and resources in where it matters, but we'll have a lot of data to show them the different things. So it's pretty exciting. A couple of highlights real fast was that we're doing, which is equally exciting, is we're starting to get into our EIS processes. And so we have a great champion project manager doing this on our I-15 EIS from Farmington to Salt Lake City. And I love the way she's approaching it. And we're just starting with the real good engagement and understanding of what's going on in that area. So it's really exciting. The study team's been formed now, and they really are looking at issues that are related to equity, looking at needs, looking at potential solutions at some point. I missed a slide, sorry. The other slide I wanted to talk about was we also have ongoing in Kearns. We've been working with them for about a year, and we're moving into a phase where we're going to look at small mobility hubs. And it's so important as you look at transit solutions and first and last mile to give, provide opportunities for communities to gather, to move transit around, to move transportation around. If you look at scooters, they need a home somewhere. And if you can tie that into places, that would be wonderful as well. So we're working on that as well in Kern. So anyway, I will turn it over to you, Eileen.
All right, thank you, Angelo. And again, thank you to all our panelists, because I think together, each of your contributions help, help our participants today get a sense of where the conversation is at, some of the specific applications that when we talk about transportation equity, what does it mean? What can it look like? And so that's really been our purpose today, is to just provide you all with some ideas, some tools, some resources for addressing equity, so that you, in whatever space that you influence or that you work within, can start to introduce these equity conversations and start thinking about what equity might mean within the decisions you can influence or that you make, or specifically related to transportation. And so with the little bit of time we have left, I wondered if I might just ask each of you to respond to a question kind of forward looking. Like, where is this all going? When we talk about transportation equity, what would be maybe a hope you have for the future, or like that picture of success? These are hard conversations. It's taken time and influence and resources to get to where we are today. And we see a positive momentum, like I said, at the local, state, and federal level. But I want to give you each a chance to just share briefly, what's your hope for the future? Where do you see all of these equity conversations going? And I'm going to just let you volunteer, whoever's ready to speak to that.
I guess for me, my hope is that, we eliminate all the isms of the world, racism, sexism, ageism, all of those things. But, that would be the goal. And we wouldn't have to have these conversations. We wouldn't have to, spend the energy. But I think in the meantime, one of the goals that I would like to see, or hope that we can all get to, is recognizing that equity, that's the very first step, recognizing equity's importance, and finding the ways to operationalize this within an organization that, like Eileen, you mentioned, that you are part of, professionally, personally. I think there's a lot of ways that we can move towards improving equity in a lot of spaces. And I think a lot of individuals, you have to think about how much action or how much power you as an individual carry. And so, just think of it on a broader sense with your community. I'll leave it with that. I know, Claudia, you were going to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, go ahead, Claudia.
No, that was wonderful, Nikki. I think for me, I have to pull in something I learned from one of our community listening sessions when we were drafting the transportation equity white paper. And this was from a frontline service provider who was working very closely with organizations and community members that needed dire services during the COVID pandemic. And something that they mentioned, and two things that they mentioned that will stick with me forever. One is, when everything went to drive-through only or drive-by only, pickup only, there are so many folks that arrived and didn't have a car. So those drive-through services weren't accessible to them because they were striving to walk up to the window for their resources, but were being turned away because they didn't have a metal equipment with 4 wheels. Like it was, they could have come through a bike, they could have just used their own 2 legs, and different mobility options that were more accessible to them. But I think what that taught me was that through the process of transportation equity, we have to be willing to learn, obviously, from each other and from different lived experiences, and understanding how different systems that we've grown so accustomed to aren't serving needs as well as they could be. But I think part of that also has to do with maybe unlearning some things. And I know for me that obviously has to do with a little bit of a humility aspect, with a compassionate mindset as well, and trying to understand. I know this is what I've traditionally done, and this is how I was trained. This is how I continue to operate maybe in my organization. And I think part of it is, again, striving to challenge that status quo a little bit, challenge what the norm is, and ask yourself that question of how did this become the norm, and how is it serving particular communities well, and how is it serving and disserving others not as well. So one of the quotes I will end right now on is from that frontline service provider, and they mentioned, I think that the transportation community in the field is made up of folks that right now ask, how can things be quicker? How can we be more efficient? How do we expand? How do we make this cheaper but better? But often we're forgetting that the focus is how humans experience transportation. It should be empathy over efficiency. Only meeting efficiency is really hurting our bottom line, which is serving the community. So again, bringing it back to that drive-through idea, it might be efficient, it might be fast, but when we put preference over efficiency and forget about empathy, we lose some folks, I think, through the cracks. So I think it's a balance of the two. And that's where I hope that we get to eventually, where we can balance both and have data-driven information, but have that be data informed rather than totally relying on maybe the hard kind of statistical things, which are important, obviously, but where do we find opportunities to also check in with ourselves and pause to understand where can we be better and where can we be more human-centered in our services.
Great. Thanks, Claudia. Angelo?
I'll go, Eileen. I loved your phrase unlearn. And, as engineers, we've learned that the only way to solve things is through, vehicle capacity, basically. And we need to unlearn that big time. And we're positioned to unlearn that. We have UDOT's adopted a quality of life framework that you should be able to unlearn it. Okay. And so we just got to keep pushing that message. So my hope, my dream, I guess, is what you asked about, Eileen. It's like, I want health issues and equity issues and thriving community to drive transportation policy and planning and projects. So if we have those 3 things in mind, to me, we are so moving in the right direction.
No, that's an exciting and inspirational kind of picture to end on. Again, I want to thank our panelists, Claudia Loaiza, Nikki Navio, and Angelo Papasvamos, for taking time to share their knowledge and experiences and things they're working on. And this is very current in the moment, things that are work in progress. And I want to thank you all for being willing to share those things that aren't necessarily all complete and packaged up in a perfect way, but that we're willing to engage and say, we know we can do better, help us understand. And I think that's the attitude of learning and openness, that Claudia started us out with, that I hope all of you listening into our session today might be willing to engage with. So with that, I will remind people that a recording of today's session will be made available in Spanish, and our YouTube channel for the Move Utah website will highlight when this is available. So look for that correspondence. And if you have friends and colleagues who might enjoy learning more about transportation equity, and their Spanish speakers would enjoy hearing the conversation in Spanish, that is going to be available. So another move towards inclusivity. And for me, I guess I'll just end on my hope for the future is that idea of inclusiveness, that all users of our transportation system can feel safe, feel like they're connected to the places they need to go, which really means being able to be connected to the people they love and want to spend time with. So thank you all for joining us today. And with that, have a great afternoon. We'll see you.